Hi, everyone. This is Dr. Gayle Carson. Welcome to Living Regret Free, a program that shows you how to live a better and more joyful life. As an added bonus, I invite you to listen to an introduction to my Mindset Matters program, which ties into this so well. Go to www.sobmindset.com. It's free, and I know you will enjoy it. If you'd like to contact me personally, drop me a line at gaylecarson13@gmail.com or go to my website, www.spunkyoldbroad.com, and sign up for my weekly newsletter. My guest today is Sandy Allen, and I have the opportunity this month of dealing with authors from the Miami International Book Fair. So we're interviewing Sandy, who is the author of A Kind of Miraculous Paradise, and that's spelled Mirraculas. So I'll have to find out about that from Sandy. But she translates her uncle's autobiography by artfully creating a gripping coming-of-age story, while sticking faithfully to the facts as he shared them. She also shares background information on her family, the culturally explosive time and place of her uncle's formative years, and the vitally important questions surrounding schizophrenia and mental health care in America more broadly. So welcome to our show, Sandy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. I do have to ask you first, what is the significance of spelling miraculous, Mirraculas?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's often the first question, why is the title misspelled? And it's one of those things where when you read the book, it'll quickly become evident. But briefly, so my story is based closely on my late uncle's autobiography that he wrote when he was a hermit who lived in his home in the desert in Northern California. And as a young person, he had grown up in Berkeley in the 60s, and he was hospitalized, according to him, at about age 16, and subsequently diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then went on to live his life. And by the time I was alive, he was a hermit, so I knew very little about what his life had actually entailed until one day, about approaching 10 years ago, actually, he mailed me his 60-page life story that he had typed on his typewriter in all capital letters, punctuated mostly with colons, no paragraphs, so these just walls of text, and the pages were yellowed and they smelled like cigarettes, and his spellings were often inventive or unique. So my book tells Bob's story faithfully to his facts. I tried to really give his account of his life a very full literary presentation. It honestly kind of reads like a novel. You're reading this coming-of-age story from his point of view as he's entering the mental health care system, and his really focuses on his kind of 10 years between that first diagnosis at age 16 and into his mid-20s, really focusing on his life as he's trying to live inside his mind, live inside the mental health care system, live inside the society at large, especially given the diagnosis he's now received, paranoid schizophrenic. And so my book in a second font tells the story I just told you about receiving the document and so forth. And it's also this space where, as you alluded, I'm exploring kind of the greater contexts in which Bob lived. And so when I'm telling the part of the book that's Bob's story, I'm doing it in a font that kind of looks like a typewriter. And occasionally I interrupt what I call my cover version of his story, in part because he was a rock musician. I interrupt my cover version with all capitals, meaning I'm quoting directly from Bob. And sometimes I'm interrupting, to use a little phrase that he typed because I really liked the way he spelled it. And I didn't really want to let go of the kind of uniqueness, the poetry or the comedy, or honestly, sometimes he typed something that was really offensive. And so I didn't want to have to kind of take it on myself, but I kind of let Bob's original stand in the all caps. So the title of the book is a quote from Bob, A Kind of Miraculous Paradise. It's actually, his line is Kind of a Miraculous Paradise. And he's describing this thing that would happen every summer when he was a kid, where his family would have driven from California all the way to Minnesota, where his parents were originally from. And he would arrive at the lake house where all of his extended family would be, and his best friend who was his cousin, and he would have the whole summer before him. And he described that feeling, the miraculous paradise of arriving at the lake in summer. So that's what the title is referring to. But I think it's an example of the title as a whole is sort of Bob's line, but it's kind of my little twist on it, and I think that's a good representation of the book as a whole. It's kind of authored by Bob, and it has his unique, touch, but I'm ultimately the person whose name is on the cover, and I'm the person who's carrying the project into the greater world.
Well, it's an interesting format for a book, and it kind of keeps the reader on track because they can tell what the difference is. They can tell where you are and where he is, and so forth. I was kind of interested in knowing the difference with the diagnosis of then with the diagnosis and treatment now, of how he handled all of that and how the family handled all of that. Because you said it was the 60s, correct?
Yeah, he was diagnosed, according to him, he was about 16, so that would make it like 1970. So,
Okay.
the
Yeah.
60s.
But there's so much change
Mhm.
in how people are treated now, and some of the medications, some of the controls. And I think in the 70s, the word, even in the 80s, and of course today it's the same, but I mean, more so in the 70s and the 80s, the word schizophrenia is very, very frightening.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that so the full title of the book, and this was in large part, my publisher was interested that the book have a subtitle that kind of gives people a better clue as to what it was about. What we landed on was a true story about schizophrenia. A true story is a quote from Bob. And that's what he typed on the cover of his book. This is the true story of a boy coming of age in Berkeley, California, who is unable to identify with reality and therefore labeled a psychotic, paranoid schizophrenic for the rest of his life. And so I sort of saw my task as bringing readers into a conversation around the status of this diagnosis. Because I think my main observation was, well, first there was the experience of just reading Bob's life. I really didn't know anything about this guy. I had a sense of this person, but what did it come from? It came from impressions that I had when I was little, when I did interact with him a little bit more, phone calls that we'd received from him. Mostly it came from what other people sort of said to me, but often in a very kind of quiet way. He's crazy, and I don't really remember whether I knew schizophrenic was the word for what he'd, been told he was, when I was younger or before I got his manuscript. But once I had it, I read his story eventually. I saw his life as he had seen himself. And there was something that began to happen inside of me, which is I wanted to better understand, okay, so what was this label that he was given? What does it mean? And that sent me down this many years long research process, which eventually became more of a reporting process, where I was really trying to understand, what did this diagnosis mean in 1970? What was the status of, the treatment? How did the treatment that he received reflect that time? But then I became more and more interested, especially, in the last few years that I was working on the project, because I worked on it for about 8 years total before it published. I really became interested in, has the situation changed? And how is what Bob experienced in 1970 different than what happens to someone who's given this diagnosis today? And how is what we as a society, what we have on offer for someone in the position of receiving this diagnosis? Is it in fact better or worse than what happened to Bob? And just understanding kind of where his story fit into the bigger picture. I would say in general, what happened to him and what happens to a lot of people now is kind of under the same paradigm. There's a paradigm that's been in power, in our society in terms of the psychiatric culture, which I think influences, the larger culture, which is diagnose and treat. And I think seeks to, you referred to controls. I do think there's a system that is rooted in public safety, and there's there's a large series of very loud debates, if you tune into them, about the nature of those medications, about what they do to people's bodies and minds long term. And the reason that I was aware of these debates was because my Uncle Bob was certainly telling his life story in order to weigh in on a lot of these questions. He was seeking to show what had happened to him during that first hospitalization, for example, which I think was a really traumatic experience unto itself. So he was talking about his experiences in psychiatric care. He was weighing in about, he took psychiatric medication, stuff like first generation antipsychotics, second generation antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics, lithium, etc. Pretty much, on and off, but for the most part, he took medication from about age 16 through to when he died at age 60. And so a big thrust of his book was critiquing the experiences he's had. And so I had to then, as his, sometime biographer, but honestly as a journalist, I was just very interested to understand, like, is Bob critiquing does science support what he's saying, or does science support the other side, or where should the general public, what should the general public hear about the nature of these debates? And that's one of those topics that hopefully the book itself, is helping us at least see the debate, because I noticed that before Bob sent me his story of his life, I didn't know anything about this. I didn't care what crazy meant. I didn't, I might see someone who's homeless and seems crazy. I might pass that person on the street and try not to see him, like a lot of Americans are accustomed to doing. But other than that level of interaction, or what portrayals of, craziness I might see on TV or in the news, I really didn't know much about these topics. And so Bob, by sending me his story, I think prompted me to begin to better understand. And what I realized was, there is this really intense debate, kind of at the highest level, about whether this paradigm is the one. Or, and then in the last few years, I've drifted in this direction as I've continued to research and report, and I've been really specifically interested in what could the next paradigm be. If the one that we've been in isn't resulting in very good outcomes for a lot of people, what are better ways that we can deal with people like Bob who clearly struggle? But it's interesting. In the book itself, one of the things that I'm looking at is it's very hard to pin down what exactly was going on before that first hospitalization. Specific to him, it's difficult to pin down some of these very basic questions. But what you see in his story is how, nonetheless, once he gets that diagnosis, once he's in the system, that really becomes his life. And I think that by the time he wrote his story, he really considered himself a very self-sufficient person, and he was an intelligent person. I think he was pretty angry about what had happened to him. And so I was trying to figure out how to kind of take that spirit, to check its facts, and to then talk to the general public in a way that was actually listening to someone who was schizophrenic. What happens if we do that?
And when you say that he was unhappy with what had happened to him, was that the schizophrenia, or was that the way schizophrenia was handled?
I would say it's the latter. I would say that a lot of what he was writing about was really focused on, I think, situations in which he was in psychiatric care where he was receiving involuntary psychiatric care. If that was an injection of Thorazine, if that was being confined in a cell. I think situations where he was being made to stay on medications that he didn't want to be on, those kinds of things. And these are issues that a lot of people who maybe have a severe mental illness diagnosis in their lives or in their immediate families, or they do a job that interacts with people with severe mental illness, these are familiar issues, right? This is one of the biggest questions, is whether involuntary psychiatric care is even care. Can it be care if it's involuntary? There's many activists who feel no, that absolutely can't be care. And then there's people, mental health professionals, psychiatrists, who feel absolutely yes. The state and families, we need to have the power to treat people who might be presenting a danger to themselves or others. These are these sorts of debates that I think, I don't know, I just was tuned out of this conversation before Bob sort of prompted me to begin to look into it. And then over time, I've begun to realize these are really big questions, I think, and they affect us all. And one of the basic reasons they affect us all is that there ultimately isn't a lot that is understood about the nature of a diagnosis like schizophrenia biologically. And if anything, the the rise of genetic analysis in the 80s, there would have been this moment there where if there was going to be some big revelation, there hasn't been. Ultimately, these diagnoses are descriptive, and there's a lot of people who feel, well, does diagnosis of this sort actually help the patient long term, especially, as you alluded to at the top? A word like schizophrenic is itself very stigmatized. So there's been research that shows that people thinking they are schizophrenic makes them feel more pessimistic about themselves because of preconceived ideas of what that diagnosis means. So is this word helping? I think that's one of the big questions that I'm looking at in the book. I don't think there's a simple answer because this word is part of our culture. It's part of our medical culture. It's something that doctors are telling people they have, you know. So if
And
that's the
a
case,
lot of people are married to schizophrenics, and when the medication does keep it under control, they achieve very great things, and they do have a happy marriage. And when they do go off their medication, that's when problems start. So there are always two sides to every story. But I'm curious to hear how you believe he came to live as a hermit
mm,
in the desert.
well, yeah, and I want to say one thing, which is I want to be clear to allow individual stories to be told and be heard because I think a lot of different people have a lot of different points of view on these topics, you know, medication and so on. And as you allude, a lot of people have people in their lives who've received diagnoses like this. There are people who choose, who feel, who decide to stay on medication. And Bob did. Bob took medication. How he became a hermit, and this story is told in the book, but eventually he hit a point where he bounces through the course of the story. He bounces between so many living situations and so many jobs, and he's in hospitals and he's in prison and he's not in prison, he's in jail, and he's in he's living on the street. He's all sorts of stuff. He's in the Air Force. He's a welder. He's a street preacher. He's abducted by aliens for several days. You know, whole shebang. Bob lives a life, but it starts to really becomes clear that it's become harder and harder for him. And eventually he makes a decision to go on disability, which means that he can't work. And as I write in the story, his father, his family has money enough that they buy him a little shack in the desert. And so he received, this is about 1980, moved there. So he received some support family, some of this house and other expenses, and he lived on his own, starting then through to when he died a few years ago. And so he took care of himself. He took care of his dogs. That's interesting because as a young person, he's kicked up, he fit in. And I do think that's one of these kind of broader points about people who end up with diagnoses like schizophrenia, even autism. You know, often you have people who I think are, you know, quote, non-normal when it comes to how they relate to others. And that's one of the first things that I think can make a person begin to isolate from others and maybe seek friendship inside or seek an interior world or seek another world to live in if the one that they're in, for example, is traumatizing or has, you know, violence in it or has sexual abuse in it. You know, very little is understood about schizophrenia, the biological construct. But in terms of people who, for example, hear voices, because by some estimations, 5% of people hear voices at some point in their lives, but people who have distressing voice hearing, one of the only kind of correlations that has been found by researchers looking at what might cause voice hearing is sexual abuse in early childhood. And so there is something there that I think is interesting to think about, which is, so right now our system, if someone is diagnosed with schizophrenia, they're isolated from the community. Maybe they're put in a cell by themselves. In Bob's case, that's what happened. He's put in a cell by himself. He's injected with Thorazine medication that's, you know, intended to slow him down, make it harder for him to kind of be in the world, feel like he's in his own head, and so on. That inhibits social connection further. He's been put on an adult ward, so he's a 16-year-old, but he's around these adults who are, you know, a lot of whom have been in the hospital a long time, and so on. So all of this, I think, has to be part of our bigger conversation when we think about this construct of the schizophrenic, you know, because ultimately people don't really exist outside of the experience they then receive if they receive a diagnosis like this, which is not to say, again, that he wasn't someone who needed help. But if we listen more to what his experience was, how could that inform, or how, you know, if we listen more to people who are in the experience of receiving the diagnosis more, what would happen if we had a system that was actually thinking about how to help people who are being isolated from others? And so often, you know, mental illness and isolation from others and loneliness are really going hand in hand. And this is a broader movement, kind of away from a strict biological approach to mental illness and toward more of a social understanding of mental illness and therefore what mental health can come from. And I think Bob's story is full of lessons about what helped him and what didn't. And one of the very basic ones is he seemed to kind of do better if he had people who were watching out for him, if he had friends, if he had a girl, you know, if he had a job, if he had a purpose, if he was living somewhere where people were kind of understanding and non-judgmental and he could spend a lot of time outside, he did better. And that was one of those things that I, over the years of reading his story, I just started to kind of feel. But then as I shifted more into reporting and really talking with people out in the world and doing a lot of reading, I saw that, oh, these are big trends, and this is happening internationally, that there is a shift toward a paradigm of care that might be more rooted in listening to those with lived experience.
Well, now, he died at a fairly young age, right? He died what did you say he died at?
He was 60, which for someone diagnosed with schizophrenia today in America is about what we would expect. People diagnosed with schizophrenia in America today are dying 15 to 25 years earlier than people who aren't diagnosed with schizophrenia, and people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia are overwhelmingly maintained on psychiatric medication, often in combination, often at high doses. Very little research has been done about the effect long-term of these kinds of medications on people's bodies. But there's definitely a body of research, and there's a lot of activists and journalists. I think the most important journalist here is Bob Whitaker, who wrote a book called Mad in America. But, they're looking at the correlation between maintenance medication and this declining lifespan, which is also attributable to a lot of other things, right? Right now in our society, if you've got a schizophrenia diagnosis, your chances of being in jail or prison are higher. Your chances of being homeless are higher. Your chances of being killed by police are higher. So you've got a population of people who are very socially vulnerable. And, that's one of the things that ultimately I realized Bob was a lucky person in a lot of senses, not the least of which was he had a family that had the support, the financial support of, the care that he received as a young person, and also the house that he eventually lived in, and how that really does change his whole life when he finally has somewhere to go where he can just be himself and be in the desert, play guitar and read the Bible and so on. He was a pretty content person. That was one of the real surprises for me when I first read to the end of his story, was realizing that he considered his life a success. That a lot of people, when they hear what my book is about, oh, it's about your uncle with schizophrenia, how sad, how tragic. I can always tell if someone hasn't read my book if that's what they think, because I don't really think that is the sense that Bob had of himself, and I don't think that that's the sense that I'm communicating with my story. I do think that there should be more hope in this conversation. Right now there's a lot of hopelessness, and I don't think it's warranted. Medically even. I think there's a lot of people overseas especially who feel that the attitude toward people who are diagnosed with schizophrenia is part of the problem, is this sense that, well, if this one route, if medication doesn't work for you, well, then we got nothing. That doesn't actually respect a lot of the research that has been done about what can help people. And one thing that can help people a lot is stable housing. It's an example of a very common sense thing that can make a huge difference to someone who's in a position like the one that Bob was in.
Well, why do you think he sent the manuscript to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. People ask me that a lot, and I don't know. I have guesses. One of my guesses is that he wanted help with his writing, and that I was the writer that he knew. I had just gotten to Iowa and was starting an MFA in nonfiction writing when he sent me his, typewritten original life story. I learned later that he had mailed photocopies of the same manuscript to other relatives before he had sent me the original, which kind of, surprised me. I think one of the reasons I didn't, because to be honest, when I first got the envelope, I was like, what is this? I would have thrown it out. It was just so, it smelled awful. It looked awful. I was just like, I don't want to get involved with whatever this is. But I didn't throw it out because it seemed like it was an original. And I kind of had this sense that he had taken a lot of time and care in typing it out, even if it was riddled with misspellings and so on. It was very clearly unconventional, but it was also very clearly something he cared about. So I was kind of intrigued, even as I had this reaction of I don't want to hear whatever this is. I don't want to get into this. That way You're trained to just kind of walk down the street past someone. I didn't want to get involved. I was really afraid of if Bob had nasty opinions about others in the family. I didn't want to be, perceived by others as seeming to side with him against them or stuff like that. I lived 2,000 miles away from my family. Like, I was very fine with keeping it that way. But
Well,
unfortunately,
it's really interesting. We only have about a minute and a half left, so
Right.
that he could even get photocopies made. I mean,
Yeah.
that in itself is amazing because he was out not close to copy places, and so
Well, he lived in the desert, but he could go into town. He would go into town when it was early in the morning and do things like grocery shop, so he didn't have to interact with a lot of people. He had his systems, but I think you're right that doing something like photocopying and mailing me the original, for example, these were big tasks for him, and I think one of the reasons he was doing them was he cared deeply that people hear what his life had really been like. I think it really bothered him that they saw him as schizophrenic and nothing else. And he wanted people to know that he was more than that label. And that was his way of trying to, he was trying to get me interested, so I think I would do something exactly like this. One of the things that came up in the course of reporting the story out was other people in the family who knew him better, because he talked on the phone with a lot of relatives. They were like, oh, yeah, Bob knew you were going to do this. And I was like, I didn't even know I was going to do this, But I think he had faith, and he was a very faithful person. And that was a big part of how he got through life. And his life was a tough one, in a lot of senses.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, for those of you out there who have either known people with schizophrenia or have people in your family with schizophrenia, this is a great read, and you should get the book. It's
Thank
called
you.
A Kind of Miraculous Paradise, a true story about schizophrenia, and it's written by Sandra Allen. And I know we don't have much time left, but she will be at the Miami Book Fair. So look for the schedule. If you are going to be in the area, look for the schedule when Sandra will be there. It should be posted. And
Yeah,
thank you so much for being with us today, Sandra.
absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed today's show. I choose my guests carefully, so if you have someone you'd like me to interview, please drop me a line at gaylecarson13@gmail.com. In the meantime, check out my intro program, Mindset Matters, at www.sobmindset.com. See you next week.